Chapter 4, Section 1. How are civilizations and empires similar and different? What is an empire? How did they grow? What did they do? How did they work? And why did they decline and fall? These are some of the questions that historians have studied and tried to figure out for centuries. In this chapter, you will learn about the difference between a civilization and an empire, the characteristics of empires, the impact of geography on civilizations and empires, how trade developed, and how empires were governed. Finally, you will look at some examples of empires from this age. In the previous unit, you learned about the early river valley civilizations and the development of a new way of living for humans. Civilizations and empires had many similarities, which can make it hard to tell the difference between the two. This is because, at their very basic level, empires exist as a subset of civilizations. By that, we mean some civilizations develop into empires as they progress. However, not all civilizations develop into empires. There are differences that can be looked for to help clarify and sort out which one is which, and when a group of people has transitioned into being an empire. The 7 characteristics of civilizations discussed earlier in the book are cities, government and law, systems of writing, specialization, social systems, complex technology, and culture, including organized religion. Empires have all of these things as well, making the two appear, on the surface at least, to be very similar. The most important difference between empires and civilizations lies with 3 main points: size, how they are governed, and growth. We have already discussed that empires are characterized by their large size, something that is not a characteristic of much smaller civilizations. In fact, most empires are a collection of civilizations brought under one ruler. These civilizations are brought into the empires and governed by force, as opposed to civilizations, which developed their own forms of leadership over time. Finally, empires typically grow and collapse much more quickly than civilizations. Empires tended to be much less stable, growing quickly into massive sizes, only to collapse in on themselves and disappear in a very short time. Ultimately, like many things in history, there is no perfect definition of exactly what is a civilization and what is an empire. There are places and people that fit some, but not all, and a constant debate for historians is how do we define and classify these places. Chapter 4, Section 2. What are the characteristics of an empire? Empires were one of the most important forces of Era 3. Empires changed and shaped the world and began to draw people more closely together. But what are the characteristics of an empire? How do we know when an empire has developed? These are just 2 of the questions to explore when studying world history. One of the first characteristics of empires is their large size. Humans began living closely along the banks of rivers and the coasts of oceans, but by this era, empires spanned thousands and sometimes more than 1,000,000 square miles. At its peak, the Roman Empire covered a territory of approximately 1.69 million square miles, and the Achaemenid Empire covered an area of approximately 3.29 million square miles. By comparison, the state of Michigan is approximately 96,716 square miles. As these empires began to stretch out and cover large territory, they began to grow in terms of populations as well. A second important characteristic of empires is their large populations. The old river valley civilizations and city-states contained many people, but these new empires had incredibly large amounts of people living in them. Estimates put the population of Rome between 50 million and 100 million people at its peak, and the Han Dynasty of China is estimated to have had around 57 million people. While it is difficult to determine exact totals due to unreliable data, that is still a lot of people. As these populations rose and borders expanded, empires began to pull more and more people into their territory and under their control. A third characteristic of empires is the fact that they rule over regions and people who live far away from where power and the government are centered, known as the core of the empire. This is an important change. People living in city-states usually were under the local control of their individual leaders, As the empires of this age expanded and developed, they began to pull new people and places under their control. Some empires forced these new subjects to adapt and change, while others allowed them to continue their lives as normal. We will see examples of these later in this chapter. Finally, the empires of this age were characterized by monarchy and oligarchy government systems. The majority of these empires were controlled by a single ruler, called a king or an emperor, or a group of rulers, called oligarchs. In either case, the ruler or rulers held total and absolute power over their territory and attempted to control all aspects of the lives of the people living within their borders. Whatever belief system the emperors held, so did those of the people they ruled. The famous example of this is when Constantine converted not only himself, but the entire Roman Empire to Catholicism before his death. You will read more about this in a later chapter. These absolute rulers used legal codes and communication as the means by which they ruled their empires. Language and forms of communication were useful in tying together groups of people within the empire who may have had little else in common. Systems of law provided people of all different backgrounds with a set of rules and expectations that would be accepted and universal across the empire.